Okay, hi everyone. This is the bonus material for the third lecture in the course on economics. Some of this content used to be in the lectures, but I thought it was basically just too advanced. So it's hopefully quite interesting. It definitely illustrates how you would apply the market distortions, market failures, hybrid policy logics ideas that we explored in the lecture to real world cases. So I think hopefully by reviewing some of this material, you'll be better able to recognize those things out in the policy challenges that you choose for your summatives. But this content is just like genuinely kind of hard to understand as a second year student, and I had to kind of rush through it a bit too much in the lectures. So I thought better to not concern people with it, make people worried about it, that sort of thing, and just have it as kind of bonus material. So sit back and hopefully enjoy this stuff, which I used to be super passionate about during my PhD, and which I still think about a lot. All right, so we're just going to be looking at a couple of hybrid public policy examples in a bit more detail. We're going to be looking at HECS, which is the income contingent loans system used to pay for higher education in the UK and in Australia and in a lot of other countries, which can also be used for a range of other applications like paying back parking tickets. And then we're also going to be looking at flexicurity, which is how the Scandinavian countries, especially Denmark, manage industrial relations. And then I'll close with a few very quick examples that you can read about on the Moodle if you're interested. All right, what's going on? Why am I? Hey, there we go. All right, so let's start with this university case study. So like, what's the policy challenge that we're trying to solve here? The policy challenge is basically that to get ahead in contemporary society, you need to have a tertiary degree. Not necessarily a university degree, but a tertiary degree. It's pretty clear here from these earnings profiles that people who are graduates of universities tend to earn more than people who just have an apprenticeship, certainly more than people who just have high school or even lower high school qualifications. The problem is that these university degrees cost a lot of money and students tend not to have a lot of money. So what we essentially want is some way for students to be able to borrow from the future in order to finance this. And we also don't want a situation where all the value of this is captured by the lender. So you could have a situation where the lender really charges a very large amount of interest that essentially means that as the person is earning more, they're also paying back a lot of interest. And so most of the benefit of earning more money goes to the lender who paid for your university degree, not for the student who actually got the degree. So the question is really how to finance university education. Part of that's an equity issue where we want people to be able to lead their best lives. Part of it's an efficiency issue where we want people in society to be productive. All right. So let's start by applying the hybrid flowchart. So this is very much an economic policy question, although there are other factors in there as well, and I think it's quite well suited to that flowchart. If you don't know what flowchart I'm talking about, go back to the main lectures and have a look there. So the question is about financing higher education, not university research. And the issue is that students don't have any money with which to pay for that education. So our first question is this problem about resource allocation? And emphatically, it's a yes. So how do we get that education out to people? How do we pay for that education? That's our resources. Is there an equity issue? Yes, almost certainly. So education is a merit good, something that we think should be distributed on the basis of need, not capacity to pay, and it's a primary good. So it's essentially a human right to be educated. It's crucial for people to be able to get ahead, to have agency, and to participate in our society. So definitely equity concerns. Is there a market failure? Yes, many market failures. Education is a club good, which means that, I will talk about it on the next slide, there's positive externalities, there's adverse selection, and there's moral hazard. So given that there are equity issues and market failures, we wouldn't expect a market for education or a market for loans to pay for education to provide an efficient outcome, an efficient allocation of education between consumers and producers. So we are probably going to need some kind of government involvement. All right, let's have a bit of a deeper look at those market failures. So education is a club good. What that means is it's non-rivalrous. So just because you're in a lecture getting educated by me doesn't stop anyone else from participating in that same lecture and also getting educated by me. I can lecture to a lot of people in a lecture theatre, and I can also lecture to essentially an unlimited number of people here on these videos. But education is also excludable, which means there are ways to prevent people from consuming the education. So we can put security doors on the lecture theatres that can only be accessed by cards that you pay for. I can put these videos on YouTube, but I can make them unlisted so only people with access to the Moodle have the URL link. Now, what this essentially means, this non-rivalrous and excludability, as we talked about in the lecture, is that adding one more student to a class costs very little. The technical meaning of that is that the marginal cost of producing the good or supplying the good to one extra person is close to zero. And what that means is that in an efficient system, we would want education to be very cheap because the marginal benefit to that extra person who comes into the class is well above zero, but the cost to provide it to them is close to zero, right? All we really have is a lot of upfront costs. The marginal costs are quite low, and so we want a higher level of education provision, which is one of the benefits of a public system where you just make education free. However, a profit maximizing firm like the University of Sydney over here, or indeed like the University of Warwick, might want to set a higher fee than zero and exclude a lot of people from education because that's how they will make more money that they can then invest in expanding their operations and getting more clout. And that's basically what you see with the University of Sydney, which recorded record profits even as it was completely screwing over their staff, especially their casual sessional academics. And this is a general problem that we have a lot across higher education these days, is that a lot of people are coming across from other sectors, like banking or whatever it might be, that have very different rules. They don't really understand the institution, the purpose of the institution, both in terms of its social mission and in terms of what its employees want to achieve. And so they mostly run it as though it was some kind of private business, and that tends to result in a lot of problems. Okay, so that's the first market failure, the club good. Then we have the second market failure, which is positive externalities. So remember that an externality is a cost or a benefit to a third party from a transaction that is not priced into that transaction. So the transaction in this case is that a uni student is buying a degree from a university. The positive externalities are that educated people, so people who have those degrees, often invent cool stuff. In the past, uneducated people invented a lot of cool stuff. That's much rarer nowadays. Educated people tend to get paid more, as we saw on the first slide, and that bids up wages for everybody in society, and they tend to be more enlightened voters, although that's a bit controversial. Now, when you have positive externality goods, the people who are getting educated aren't being compensated by everyone else who benefits for their level of education, and so they tend to underconsume their education relative to what would be optimal for society. So what we see here is that markets left to their own devices will undersupply education as far as the social equilibrium is concerned. And one thing we can do in this case is subsidize people to go and get education, because that essentially prices in some of that benefit that is provided to society in general, collect it through taxation, pay it to the educated people to get educated. One big challenge we have here is in calculating the size of that externality and then calculating the appropriate size of the subsidy. Basically impossible to do, one of the hard problems of economics. Consultancies, though, will constantly be writing reports calculating the value of society of higher education, because consultancies have no ethics. All right, I mean, I went too far there, but there is a report from Deloitte trying to calculate the value of the Australian higher education sector to Australian society, and the modelling section in the appendix is just an absolute joke. But they'll do it because you'll pay them some money. The university said we need a document by some independent consultants to do this work for us, and so they did. Anyway, I'll stop talking about that. The next market failure we have is adverse selection. So this is the issue where risk is unclear, and so it's very hard to price things. You might be thinking to yourself, like, well, where does risk come into me deciding whether to get an education? Well, the main thing is not so much in the transaction between you and the university, it's the transaction between you and whoever might give you a loan to fund your education. You are a risky proposition to that funder, and it's that risk and the lack of clarity about how risky you are from where we get the adverse selection. So let's start exploring this way. One way that we could get those loans to students is to let banks provide the loans, or just general kind of classic financial providers. The issue is that if I'm a private bank, my interest is to give expensive loans to students who are definitely going to repay. So what that means is that the loans would generally be pricey, which is not necessarily something we want in an equity scenario. And banks will tend to avoid students who are maybe a bit unlikely to repay, and those students tend to be minorities, tend to be otherwise marginalised people. Now, hopefully there'll be a lot of competition between banks, between the people who are offering these loans, and that's going to reduce those interest rates. They won't be that expensive, but it's not going to reduce the interest rates to zero, because then they won't be making any sort of profit if they're a private bank. The second problem is that there's always going to be some ambiguity around marginal students. So students who might repay, but there's a risk that they won't. And banks will tend to err on the side of caution, and they won't give loans to those marginal students. And that will essentially lock those students out of those high returns to education that we saw in the first slide. So private firms are not going to offer loans to risky students, even though a lot of those students would go on to graduate, they would get ahead and they would repay their loans. So again, we seem to have a situation where a pure market solution, so in this case just leaving it up to the private financial market to provide these loans, is going to get us a suboptimal outcome. All right. Then we also have a brief look at some equity issues that are peculiar to this particular university policy challenge. So here we are looking at what are called repayment burdens. So this is kind of when you're repaying your student loans, what portion of your income is going just to that debt repayment as opposed to being left for you to live your life with or to build up savings with so that you can try to make further investments in, say, property and get off London's outrageous real estate market. We tend to find that high debt, low income students and these marginal students receiving private loans are very common in that group, pay a substantial portion of their earnings in interest, and it takes them decades to pay off their loans. Sometimes they die with them. And this really impedes their self-investment. So you can see over here on the graphic that the richest 10% of households don't really find that they have these repayment burdens. But the lowest fifth, the bottom quintile of people, and these are people who have degrees, or at least like went to university, are often paying like up to 25% of their income as debt repayments. And that is like crippling. It's very hard to sort of live your life in that case. And strikingly in the US, and I believe this is US debt, student loans are the only form of borrowing from which you cannot declare bankruptcy. There is a special law to say that you cannot declare bankruptcy from student debt. And this strikes me as an example of rent seeking, which we talked about in the bonus material from the second lecture on how economists think about equity. So one of the big issues here is that the people who are making these loans don't bear any risk because these people can't discharge their loans in bankruptcy. And I think that is a serious moral hazard and a massive flaw in the US approach. Anyway, just in general, this sort of thing impedes people's self-investment. So they can't get further educated, they can't do jobs that they actually enjoy, they have to do jobs that they're paid more for, and they generally don't save money and build up for retirement and this kind of stuff. These issues are much more likely to afflict students who were poor to begin with, and it means that they are more likely to stay poor, so it's undermining our efforts to improve people's mobility through education, and it's also more likely to affect women because women tend to take more time out from the workforce in order to have kids than men, and that really exacerbates these repayment burdens because the women's earnings go down for a period, and that means that they then pay more interest in the long run. One other issue with this is that it encourages people into high paying but not necessarily high social value jobs. So things that have high market value but not necessarily social value. So things like consulting and finance rather than care professions, parenting, that sort of thing. All right. And then our final market failure is moral hazard. So we saw that the private banking market would not provide us with an efficient outcome. Maybe from that we might conclude that we should do the opposite. We should make education free. And it is free in quite a few countries, so we have a reasonable understanding of what goes on in this kind of scenario. And I would say that broadly this isn't a great idea either. The main issue is that there's overconsumption of education when you make it free, and that's partially because of moral hazard. You're spending someone else's money. The government is paying for your education, the taxpayer is paying for your education. You don't have much of an incentive to really do anything with that education. So you get this phenomena in the European universities of massive over-enrollments in programs, and then people just don't really show up. And this is quite wasteful in terms of administrative costs of universities. So we have a lot of transactions costs associated with that. There's no pricing of the cost to society of having people studying rather than working. So essentially what we've got here is an excess subsidy to education. So I mentioned how hard it is to calculate the value of the appropriate externality, positive externality from education. And so it's hard to calculate the size of the subsidy, but it's probably not sort of infinite as it is here. It's also a problem that if you're paying zero for your degree, then you have quite a weak bargaining position with respect to the lecturers to get them to do a better job as far as educating you. And we tend to find that European universities often offer slightly lower salaries and worse facilities to academics, but it's not always the case. But it does seem to be that the better academics tend to gravitate to the higher paying US institutions. So a pure government solution also seems somewhat suboptimal. Pure market suboptimal, pure government suboptimal. Maybe we need a hybrid policy, and that's where these income contingent loans come in, which you do have in the UK, but you're missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, which I'll tell you about a bit later. So a key thing with the income contingent loans approach is that you only repay loans once you make a middle class salary. And that's essentially the fifth income decile. I'm not that familiar with the UK system, but I believe it's the same story here. It's not the same story in the United States. In the United States, just once you graduate, you're repaying these guys. In Australia, if you're graduated and you're unemployed, or if you graduate and you become a mother and you never go to work, then you'll never make any repayments, and so there's no repayment burdens unless you can afford that burden. Second key point is that the interest rate on these loans is indexed to inflation, which means that the real value of the loan doesn't increase over time, only the nominal value. And what that means is that there's no loss to government over time from providing these loans because people pay it back in the value that it was given to them. But there's also no incentive for the private sector to come in and make money off this because they can't charge any real interest on these loans. Another crucial feature is that if you have the government making these loans, and the government is making loans to those marginal students that I talked about, the ones who might not repay, then nicely the government can recoup the losses that it makes on marginal students who don't graduate or don't repay for whatever reason, through the higher, not just the repayments of the students who do graduate, but also through the higher tax receipts on the increased earnings of all the people who get to go to university because of this system of income contingent government-backed loans. So in the US, those private banks that are giving the loans, the only way they can make money is by getting it back from the specific individual students that they gave the loans out to. In the government's case, they're making higher tax receipts, not just from the students who are educated, but also generally from the society being richer because everyone in it is educated. Right? So we get a kind of ratcheting effect there. So examples of this system in action are the HECS system in Australia, which is where it was invented by Bruce Chapman, who's a colleague of mine where I did my PhD, where it's the Higher Education Contribution Scheme. HECS also includes a subsidy for most degrees, so it's not just this income contingent loan. There's some attempt to price in the positive externality of education. That subsidy tends to be larger in areas where there's a labour shortage, so we're trying to incentivize people to go into those areas. And then the final piece of the policy is price caps on fees, except in oversubscribed courses. So for the most part, universities can't charge over a certain amount, and it's true in the UK too, but those price caps are much higher in the UK in ways that I don't think are quite right, but the university administration and even my head of department disagrees with me. But in Australia, there's a few courses like law where there's just way too many lawyers being trained. There's more lawyers being trained in Australia at any one time than there are actual lawyers practicing law. And so we don't subsidise and we don't cap those courses. Like if people want to piss their money away doing law, then they can, but we're not going to help them do that. All right. Now, the crucial reason why you need price caps is basically that a lot of teaching fees are not used to pay for teaching. They're used to pay for research. So they cross-subsidize research. And you often hear this kind of rhetoric that if fees were deregulated, it would improve the student experience. And I think that's basically bullshit because all of that money would go either towards research financing, from which students really just don't benefit. Like, I don't really think that there's basically anything in this course that has come out of my research. Like if I was just a full-time teacher, I would still be picking up a lot of the kind of new, fresh content in this course just from talking to people about the place, and I would be staying up to date with what's going on. I really don't need to be producing cutting-edge, world-class research in order to give you guys a good teaching experience. And in fact, I sometimes think that if my research was really world-class, you guys definitely wouldn't be able to understand it. Like, world-class research should not be legible to an undergraduate because there should be a lot of knowledge that you need to have already in order to understand that kind of research. So I don't think students benefit from this research cross-subsidy, although there is certainly a case that if a university has a good research reputation, employers assume that the students coming out of it will be really smart. But this is a kind of perverse scenario where people are using proxy information for the thing that they actually want to observe, which is students' productivity. And often universities that are a bit lower down the research ranking, like Warwick, I would say, but also like the main Australian universities, offer a slightly better education in many ways than universities that are very high up the research ranking. Because at the research universities, the priority is research, not teaching. Now, because of this research to teaching to research cross-subsidy, there is a perverse incentive on the part of the universities to increase student numbers while reducing the quality of education, because that will result in more cost savings that can be used for research. The other thing that they can be used for is just useless administrative bloat. So it's absolutely undeniable that the majority of universities over the last 20 years have seen a huge expansion in the number of middle managers they have who are doing stuff that it's not really clear what the value add is, certainly what the value add is to students. So we have, for example, a very large impact and outreach group at Warwick that's supposed to bring our research to the public. I've been here for a year. The only interaction I've had with them is them sending me an email to ask me whether I wanted to tell them about work that I was doing that was impactful. So they're not even taking any effort to find out what people are doing in the university. We have to volunteer our own information to them, despite them having like 80 staff or something. So I don't know what's going on there, but it's a colossal amount of money. All right. One maybe corollary point worth mentioning here is that teachers, like myself, often have trouble striking about our conditions at the university because we feel like students are paying so much for these degrees, especially the international students, that we shouldn't strike. We feel guilty about that, right? We want to give you guys value for money. So in a sense, debt, particularly high amounts of debt, makes people easier to control. Competition makes students and teachers less likely to cooperate. And we end up with another issue, which is that there is a kind of consumer failure of understanding what is valuable in a degree. So oftentimes what you're paying for is a signal that you have a good education, but what that signal is actually that you went to a university with good researchers. And sometimes this can be quite misleading. So for example, at the ANU where I did my undergraduate in philosophy, this is a world top 5 philosophy department and has been for a very long time. The department has about 60 philosophers in it, I reckon, based on seminar attendance. And I would say, I think something like 7 of them do undergraduate teaching, and they are not the stars of the faculty. Whereas the stars of the faculty do no undergraduate teaching whatsoever. So the research ranking of philosophy at the ANU is not a good indicator of the quality of the philosophy graduates. All right. So anyway, hopefully that's given you a sense for why the income contingent loan system is good, and also why you should be kind of skeptical of claims that what the universities need is for fees to be deregulated. What the universities actually need to do is reduce their cost base. They have a ridiculous cost base, and it is not salaries to lecturers. The next hybrid I want to talk about a bit is flexicurity. So this is the way that Denmark in particular manages the relationship between employers and employees. So that's what we call industrial relations, the negotiations between labour and capital over wages and productivity. So we apply that hybrid flowchart again. Is the policy challenge about resource allocation? Yes, it's about how we allocate as a society our labour and our capital, what are called factor inputs in economics, and how we compensate them with rents and wages. Is there an equity issue? Yes. So one thing that we're particularly concerned about in industrial relations is fair pay, but also unemployment insurance. So what happens to people when they can't find a job? The unemployment system, the welfare payment system, and the wage payment system and employment are very closely linked through employment and unemployment. Right? Is there a market failure in this place? Yes. The main one is about information asymmetries, and quite complex information asymmetries concerning what skills are required by productive firms in the economy. So they need skills, so employers need to get those skills, but then those skills are provided by a whole separate set of institutions, the educational institutions. And then there's also the question of what is reasonable remuneration for those skills. So we often want the market to be able to decide that reasonable remuneration, so to set wages. We don't want wages to be set by a central government because they can't process the information fast enough. But there remains a lot of information asymmetries even in a free market, and so there is a coordination problem here that government can be quite useful in solving, where we need to coordinate between employer groups, employee groups, and education providers, and often individual employers and individual employees are not informed enough to have a good decision-making apparatus here, so we need to have them organised, and then the government can coordinate that organisation. And that's where you get industrial relations. Now, in a lot of countries, industrial relations is quite adversarial, which means it's very combative between labour groups and employer groups, particularly in English-speaking nations. So I would say that the UK, the US, Australia, Canada to a slightly lesser extent have very adversarial industrial relations systems. They put labour and capital into conflict, even though labour and capital are in fact mutually dependent, and so we would be much better served by a more symbiotic relationship. These kind of adversarial systems tend to be pro-capital because labour has a much bigger collective action problem than capital. So bosses, employer groups, tend to employ thousands of workers, so a couple of bosses can get together and quickly sort out what their position is on a particular industrial relations problem, whereas the unions have to get thousands of workers together to decide what their view is on a particular issue. If you want to get a sense for this, go and have a look at the recent strike action by the Las Vegas hospitality workers, where they had to hire out a football stadium to have their general assembly because there's that many hospitality workers who are unionized in Las Vegas. These kind of adversarial systems also tend to quite quickly go to arbitration, which is a kind of legal decision-making process using rules rather than negotiation. These countries where adversarial stuff tends to be common also tend to have quite punitive systems with respect to unemployment. So you tend to be punished for being unemployed. So the kind of unemployment payments you get, sort of welfare payments you get, tend to be breadline, which means that they're enough to meet your basic needs for food and rent barely, but really nothing beyond that. Absolutely no capacity to like even have a beer with your friend or something. Let alone like take a brief weekend holiday once a year or something. They also tend to expire quite quickly, so you're under a lot of pressure to get a new job. And if they don't expire, then you usually have a lot of workfare requirements, which is that you can only continue to claim unemployment benefits if you demonstrate that you are intensively looking for work. And usually you have a very short window between starting to get payments and having to prove that you're looking for work. So there's really no time to kind of catch your breath when you become unemployed. And then if you're long-term unemployed, then the government really starts to get up here, and you have to start doing things like mandatory psychology training for learned helplessness. So the reason why you can't get a good job is because you have the wrong attitude. You're just not positive enough. You need to be more positive. I find this to be one of the most deeply undignified, humiliating, and just frankly like dystopian features of UK employment policy. All right, so how does the Danish flexicurity system differ? So one of the first ways in which it differs is that it has good faith bargaining. So the key idea here is that when unions and bosses negotiate, the bosses must release their books to the union, which means they must show the union who they're employing, how much capital is being invested, how much profit they're making. And I think this is just so obviously fundamental to a good negotiation. In Australia, where bosses don't need to do this, they can just pretend like they're not making money and that, we can't possibly pay wages because we can't afford to. If you reveal the books, then it becomes clear whether you can in fact afford to. It's much harder to negotiate in a duplicitous, deceptive way. Governments then coordinate in Denmark between industry groups, unions, and education providers regarding what skills shortages there are, what training is required to meet those skills shortages, how much training that costs, how hard those skills are, and thus then how much a reasonable wage would be for those skills. This is leveraging one of the main strengths of government, which is to see the big picture and to organise a lot of small actors within the economy. The government does not play the role of a wage setter, of someone who is making decisions. The decisions are left to the actors within the economy. The government just helps to bring those actors together. So it helps to solve that information asymmetry I talked about and encourages better collective or social outcomes, which depend on this symbiotic relationship between labour or capital. Turning from the kind of macro organisation of industrial relations specifically to the way unemployment is handled in the Danish system, key plank of this approach is what's called unemployment insurance. So while you are employed, you pay an extra levy of, I think, about 1.5% of tax. Then when you are unemployed, you are eligible to claim almost replacement wages. So rather than getting a very minimal payment that just allows you to buy food, you actually get almost whatever wage you were getting before you were fired for the first 6 months of your unemployment. And that means that unemployment does not trigger a financial crisis for you personally. You can still pay for your mortgage, you can still pay for your kids' after school activities, you can still pay your heating bills, you can still replace your couch, this sort of thing. Any plans you have remain in action. So this is giving you time and resources for long-term planning. That might include thinking about, do I need to retrain? Who could give me the retraining? It allows you to do a meaningful job search and find a job that is actually a good fit for the perhaps quite particular skills you have. And so you'll get a good wage in that job because it's for your skills. Whereas if you were pushed quickly into a job, maybe you'd be off the government's books, but you wouldn't be making as much money. And so your life would be shitter and you'd have a much crapper retirement where you potentially would be more dependent on the government for pension payments. So a lot of this is about long-term optimization versus short-term optimization. After that first 6 months of unemployment, the payments fall to a subsistence level, so that prevents people from dole bludgeoning, right? Prevents people from just lounging around on unemployment benefit. And Denmark and the other countries that have this sort of approach, like Germany, tend to also have quite a strong Protestant work ethic in the culture that discourages people from not working. A final crucial point is that if you have these strong unemployment insurance regimes, it really improves labour's bargaining position because their outside option is very attractive. So if I'm earning $60,000 here and I can, let's say if I'm earning £40,000 in this job and I can also earn £40,000 for a few months while I go look for a different job, then I'm much more likely to leave this job if my boss starts acting like a dickhead. And I think that's really quite important for making people comfortable with the idea of switching jobs and looking for better jobs. And it really improves the ability of labour to demand better conditions, and most people are labourers, not bosses. So I think this is quite an attractive thing. It's particularly important in 21st century labour markets where skills are changing frequently, jobs are changing frequently, firms are retooling themselves frequently, because this makes people comfortable with changing jobs. It's very important for a dynamic labour market. All right. What are the kind of hybrid benefits of this approach? So the first thing is that Denmark, contrary to a lot of people's understanding, is in fact not a socialist utopia. In fact, Denmark and the Scandinavian countries are highly neoliberal in the way they organise their economic policy. It's more on the cultural front that we see the kind of social stuff going on. So the Danish labour market is largely unregulated. It's very easy to hire people in that labour market. It's also very easy to fire people. In the UK, you have a lot more emphasis on job security. In Denmark, you have an emphasis on income security. That's where that unemployment insurance comes from. People aren't so worried about losing their jobs because they have the income protection. What they want is for them to be able to get jobs very easily and achieve good wages in those jobs. So an interesting example of this is that in Germany, which has a similar system, they didn't have a minimum wage at all until very recently. Hiring and firing was relatively easy and payroll taxes were quite low. And this is because people's outside option, the welfare payments that they could get, were so high that it forced employers to offer them a good minimum wage because otherwise they wouldn't come and work for them. So we have what comes with this is quite a dynamic market, generally higher wages, higher productivity, more job change, less unemployment because obsolete industries close, workers don't hang around when they're duds, firms can fire dud workers, workers can leave dud firms. Generally, the detritus in the economy is getting cleared away and the new fresh growth is always there, and that improves productivity, wages, returns to capital, all the rest of it. Danes have some of the highest labour turnover rates in the OECD, so people get fired a lot in Denmark, or they change jobs a lot, much more than in the UK. But in opinion surveys, most people have a very positive attitude to job mobility and they put very little emphasis on job security. And as I said, I think this is quite important for 21st century labour markets that are going to be super dynamic because of the nature of technological change. All right, last slide here. I just thought I'd point you to a couple of other examples. So on the Moodle, I've got chapters from a book that I edited a few years back on industrial policy by Volker Treichel, who is the South Asia lead for the World Bank. On healthcare by Andrew Podger, who was the Secretary of Health in the Australian Public Service. Our healthcare system is really great, I would say, very smartly designed. And then another chapter by Podger and also Mike Keating, who was the head of the PMO, the kind of central agency in the bureaucracy on retirement savings and pensions, which is an area where I think Australia has innovated a lot, but where we maybe got some things wrong. And so that's an interesting example of where hybrid logic kind of maybe lets you down, in part because we used rational choice theory and that was not a psychologically realistic way of understanding people's retirement savings. I want to briefly mention one other example, which is monopoly management, which I haven't put on Moodle, but which is a very prominent thing in the UK. You have a lot of natural monopolies in the UK that were privatised under the Thatcher government. Natural monopolies are not well suited to full privatisation, and so you have a lot of governments, the Scottish National Party, Corbyn's Labour, wanting to renationalise a lot of those industries. But natural monopolies also cannot be managed well with nationalisation. We want some kind of hybrid approach, and there are two main hybrid approaches to natural monopolies. A natural monopoly, I should say, is a monopoly. So you have one firm or a couple of firms, an oligopoly, as the only actors in a particular market. And the problem is that in a natural monopoly, usually what you have is increasing returns to scale. So the bigger a firm is, the more efficient it is at providing that good. And so you basically just want one firm to do the whole thing. And the classic example is railways. So you don't want one company taking you a bit of the way and then you swap to a different train company and then they have to coordinate because you just run a lot of transactions costs there. You want one train company for the entire country. So what we do then is we either use flexible price caps, which basically means that we say to the firm, you can charge this much for the good. Now figure out how to make cost savings on everything else so that you can make a profit between that amount that you charge to the user and the cost that you pay in order to provide that good. And this is typically how most energy markets are run. And then what you do is you revise those price caps periodically. So you say, this is how much money you can make. The firm then tries to improve its productivity and its efficiency so they can make more profits. And then as their profits start to rise, you update the price cap and you bring it down. So there's once again pressure on them to improve their profitability, and you're able to pass on those occasional improvements in productivity to the consumers in the form of lower prices through the price cap. So that's the slightly more statist approach, I guess. Well, it's hard to say. So you're using regulation there, but you're also using market-based incentives to encourage improvements. Kind of on the flip side of that, but trying to get at a similar outcome, is what's called corporatization. So you run a public entity. So you have a national railway provider like Deutsche Bahn in Germany, and you have them operate like a private company, but the managers of that company, rather than being incentivized to maximize profit, which is disastrous in a monopoly because it results in high prices for consumers under provision of the good, instead you encourage them to reduce costs. So you don't reward them for profit maximization, you reward them for providing the good at the rate that society wants it, as efficiently as low cost as possible to save money for the taxpayer. I'm generally inclined to think corporatization is a better option for railways, at least, but Deutsche Bahn in Germany is almost as shit as British Railways. All right, I hope that was an interesting bit of bonus lecture. look forward to seeing you guys in the lectures next week. Thanks. How do I get off my screen?